She stood there, clutching a tiny painting in her frail hands, eyes filled with silent hope. People rushed past her, not even glancing her way. No one cared. No one stopped, until one mysterious man appeared. What happened next left the entire crowd speechless. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure you are subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Hit that bell icon so you never miss another powerful tale. And if this story moves you, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring you more heartwarming stories. Also, let us know, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our amazing community. Now, get ready for a story that will leave you in chills. The marketplace was bustling with activity. People walked past, lost in their own worlds, their minds occupied with the worries and distractions of daily life. Vendors shouted, advertising their goods, while children laughed and played, running through the narrow lanes. Amidst all of this, in a quiet corner of the street, stood a little girl. Her clothes were worn, her tiny hands clutched a handful of paintings, and her eyes carried a sorrow far too deep for someone so young. She had been standing there for hours, hoping someone would stop, hoping someone would notice. But no one did. People glanced at her for a moment, then continued on their way. Some even looked at her paintings, admiring them for a fleeting second before turning away without a word. Others simply ignored her, as if she did not exist at all. Her name was Aisha. She was only 8 years old. Life had already shown her its cruel side. She had once lived in a warm home, filled with laughter and love. But that was before tragedy struck. Her mother had fallen ill, and without money for treatment, her condition had worsened. Doctors had given them a deadline. Without immediate treatment, there would be no hope. Aisha was too young to understand the complexities of medicine and money, but she understood one thing. She could not lose her mother. Desperate and determined, she had taken her small collection of paintings, the ones she had made with love and passion, and set out to sell them. She had heard stories of people being kind, of strangers helping those in need. Maybe, just maybe, someone would help her today. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. Aisha's legs were tired, but she refused to sit down. She had to keep trying. She had to believe that someone would come. But as the day dragged on, hope began to fade from her eyes. Was no one willing to help? Was there really no kindness left in the world? Then, just as the last light of day began to dim, a shadow fell over her. A tall figure stood before her. Aisha looked up, her heart pounding. The man was well-dressed, his presence commanding yet gentle. He picked up one of her paintings, studying it carefully. There was something different about him. He was not like the others who had merely glanced and walked away. He was truly looking. "This is beautiful," he said softly, his voice deep and kind. Aisha's hands trembled. She had heard words like these before, but they had always been followed by disappointment. Would this be any different? "How much for this one?" the man asked. Aisha hesitated. She had priced her paintings low, hoping they would sell quickly. But in that moment, something inside her urged her to speak the truth. "I just need enough to help my mother," she whispered. The man's expression changed. There was something in his eyes, a deep understanding, a sadness that mirrored her own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Without counting, he placed it in Aisha's trembling hands. "This should be enough," he said. Aisha stared at the envelope, her breath caught in her throat. It was heavy, too heavy. She opened it slightly and gasped. It was filled with cash, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Her lips parted to speak, to thank him, to tell him that this was too much. But before she could say a word, the man smiled and turned away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. Tears filled Aisha's eyes. She clutched the envelope to her chest, unable to believe what had just happened. She looked around, searching for the mysterious stranger, but he was gone. Just like that, in the span of a few moments, her life had changed forever. She ran home as fast as her legs could carry her. When she burst through the door, her mother looked up in surprise. Aisha dropped the envelope on the table, tears streaming down her face. "We can go to the hospital now," she cried. Her mother's hand shook as she picked up the envelope, her eyes widening as she saw what was inside. "Aisha, where did you get this?" Aisha smiled through her tears. "An angel helped us," she whispered. Days later, as Aisha sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching her rest peacefully, she thought about the man who had changed their lives. She never got his name. She never even got to thank him. But she knew that wherever he was, he had saved them. Sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, kindness appears. And sometimes, a single act of generosity can change a life forever. The city streets were alive with movement. People rushed from one place to another, caught up in their daily routines, their conversations, their phones, their own thoughts. The sound of traffic hummed in the background, and the occasional honk of a horn pierced the air. Vendors lined the sidewalks, calling out to potential customers, selling everything from fresh fruit to handmade jewelry. It was a place full of life, full of stories. Yet amidst it all, a little girl stood alone, unnoticed, invisible. Her name was Aisha. She was just 8 years old. She clutched a handful of paintings close to her chest, her small fingers gripping them tightly as if they were her last hope. And in many ways they were. Her eyes darted from person to person, searching for kindness, searching for someone who might stop, someone who might care. But no one did. People walked past her as if she did not exist. Some glanced in her direction, their eyes brushing over her paintings for a brief second before looking away. Others barely noticed her at all, their minds too preoccupied with their own lives to acknowledge the little girl standing in the middle of the busy street. Some whispered to each other, wondering what she was doing there, but none of them stopped to ask. None of them reached out to help. Aisha had been standing there for hours. Her legs ached, her stomach rumbled, but she refused to leave. She had no choice. Her mother was sick, and they had no money for treatment. The doctors had made it clear, without immediate medical care, there was little hope. Aisha was too young to understand medical terms or financial struggles, but she understood one thing. She could not lose her mother. She had spent the last few days painting, using whatever scraps of paper and color she could find. She had poured her heart into each brushstroke, creating images filled with love, pain, and hope. Now, all she needed was someone willing to buy them. Just one kind soul. Just one person who would stop and see her, truly see her. But no one did. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street. Aisha's hands trembled as she held out one of her paintings, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the next person would stop. But just like the ones before, they kept walking. And then he arrived. A tall figure emerged from the crowd, his steps slow and deliberate. He was well-dressed, wearing a long coat that billowed slightly in the evening breeze. His presence commanded attention, but there was something else about him, something that made Aisha's heart race. Unlike the others, he did not just glance at her and walk away. He stopped. For the first time that day, someone truly looked at her. He bent down slightly, his eyes scanning the paintings in her hands. Aisha held her breath, afraid that he would admire them for a moment and then leave like everyone else. But he did not. "These are beautiful," he said softly. Aisha blinked up at him, unsure if she had heard correctly. Her voice wavered as she whispered, "They are for sale." The man studied the paintings again, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Without hesitation, he placed it in her trembling hands. "This should be enough," he said. Aisha's fingers curled around the envelope, its weight unfamiliar. She peeked inside and gasped. It was filled with cash, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Tears welled up in her eyes. "But why?" she asked. The man smiled, a warmth in his eyes that she had not seen in anyone else that day. "Because sometimes All someone needs is a little help, he said. Before she could say another word, before she could even think to thank him, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. Aisha stood frozen, the envelope still clutched in her hands. Her heart pounded in her chest as reality set in. This was real. This was happening. She had the money. She could take her mother to the hospital. She turned on her heels and ran, her small feet pounding against the pavement. When she burst through the door of their tiny home, her mother looked up in surprise. "We can go to the hospital now," Aisha cried, tears streaming down her face. Her mother's hands shook as she took the envelope, her eyes widening as she saw what was inside. "Aisha, where did you get this?" Aisha smiled through her tears. "An angel helped us," she whispered. Days later, as she sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching her rest peacefully, she thought about the man who had changed their lives. She never got his name. She never even got to thank him. But she knew that wherever he was, he had saved them. And sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, kindness appears. And sometimes, a single act of generosity can change a life forever. The marketplace was alive with motion. Voices overlapped in the air. Vendors shouting out prices, customers bargaining, children laughing as they weaved through the crowd. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of street food, while the evening sun cast golden hues over the bustling scene. But in the midst of all this life, there was one figure who stood still. A little girl. Her name was Aisha. She was no older than 8, her small frame swallowed by the crowd moving around her. She clutched a bundle of paintings, her tiny hands gripping them as if they were her last hope. And in many ways, they were. For hours, she had been standing in the same spot. The exhaustion in her legs was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on her heart. She had painted each piece with love, with desperation, with a silent prayer that someone would stop and buy them. Because her mother needed medicine, because time was running out, because she had no other choice. The people walked past her, lost in their own lives. Some noticed her for a moment, their eyes flicking toward the painting she held before they turned away. Others barely even acknowledged her existence. No one stopped. Aisha swallowed hard. Maybe she should speak louder. Maybe she should move to another street. But what if the same thing happened there? What if no one cared no matter where she stood? She tightened her grip on the paintings, biting her lip to stop the tears that threatened to fall. Her mother had always told her to be strong, to believe in kindness, to never lose hope. But today, hope was slipping through her fingers. And then it happened. One unexpected customer, one moment, and the entire world seemed to stop watching. A tall figure emerged from the moving crowd, his steps slow and deliberate. He was different, not because of the way he dressed or the way he carried himself, but because, unlike everyone else, he saw her. He truly saw her. His eyes scanned her paintings, and then he bent down slightly. "Did you paint these?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something else in it, something that made Aisha's heart pound. She nodded quickly. Yes. He picked up one of the paintings, studying it with quiet appreciation. "These are beautiful," he murmured. Aisha had heard those words before. People had admired her work before, but admiration never turned into action. Compliments never turned into money. She forced herself to speak. "They are for sale." The man's expression did not change. He did not hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick envelope, and placed it in her trembling hands. Aisha's breath caught. The envelope was heavy, too heavy. She hesitated before peeking inside and gasped. It was filled with cash, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Her fingers clenched around it, her mind spinning. This could pay for her mother's treatment. This could change everything. She looked up, her lips parting to speak, to ask him why, to thank him, to tell him that this was too much. But before she could say a word, the man smiled softly, Sometimes the world just needs to stop and pay attention, he said. And then, before she could react, before she could fully process what had happened, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Aisha stood there, frozen. For the first time in hours, she did not care about the people walking past her. She did not care about the ones who had ignored her. She did not care about those who had treated her as invisible, because one person had seen her, and that was enough. The world may have kept moving, but in that moment, in that life-changing moment, it had stopped just long enough. Aisha clutched the envelope to her chest and ran. She burst into her tiny home, gasping for breath. Her mother, frail and weak, turned her head toward her. "Aisha, what happened?" Aisha dropped the envelope onto the table, her voice shaking with emotion. "We can go to the hospital now." Her mother's eyes widened as she opened the envelope, her hands trembling. "Aisha, where did you get this?" Aisha wiped at her tears, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Someone stopped. Someone saw me." Days later, as she sat beside her mother's hospital bed, she thought about the man who had changed their lives. She never got his name. She never got to say thank you. But she knew, wherever he was, that single moment had changed everything. Sometimes, it only takes one person to make the world stop. And sometimes, a single act of kindness is all it takes to save a life. The city streets were bustling with life, a never-ending rush of people lost in their own worlds. The honking of cars, the chatter of passers-by, and the rhythmic footsteps of hurried commuters filled the air. It was a world that never stopped moving, never paused and noticed the small things, or the small people. And among the crowd, standing alone with a bundle of paintings clutched to her chest, was a little girl. Aisha was only 8 years old, yet she carried the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. She had spent the entire day standing on the corner of the street, hoping, praying, that someone would stop and buy her artwork. But no one did. She was invisible. People glanced at her, some with pity, some with disinterest, but all with the same result. They kept walking. No one asked why she was there. No one asked why her big brown eyes held so much sadness. No one asked why her hands trembled slightly as she held out a painting to yet another passerby, only to be ignored. Her mother was sick. The doctors had given them bad news, but Aisha did not fully understand their words. All she knew was that her mother needed medicine they could not afford. And so Aisha did the only thing she could. She painted. She poured her heart into every brushstroke, hoping that someone, anyone, would buy her work. But the hours dragged on, and hope began to slip away. Then, just as she was about to give up, something unexpected happened. A man stopped. Not just any man. He was tall, well-dressed, and had an air of quiet authority about him. Unlike the others, he did not glance at her and walk away. He did not pretend not to see her. He truly looked at her. "These are your paintings?" he asked. Aisha nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." The man knelt slightly, picking up one of the paintings. He examined it carefully, his expression unreadable. "These are beautiful," he finally said. Aisha swallowed hard. She had heard those words before. People often admired her work, but admiration did not pay for medicine. Compliments did not save lives. "They are for sale," she said hesitantly. The man nodded, without another word. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it gently in her small hands. Aisha looked down at it, confused. It was heavy. When she peeked inside, her breath caught. It was filled with cash. More money than she had ever seen. Her hands trembled. "Sir, this is too much." The man smiled softly. "No, it is just enough." Before she could say another word, before she could even fully process what was happening, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Aisha stood frozen, her heart pounding. Was this real? Had this really happened? Tears welled up in her eyes as she clutched the envelope to her chest. This was it. This was enough to get her mother the help she needed. She ran home as fast as her legs could carry her. When she burst through the door, her mother looked up in surprise. Aisha? Aisha dropped the envelope onto the table, gasping for breath. We can go to the hospital now. Her mother's hand shook as she opened the envelope, her eyes widening at the sight of the money. Aisha, where did this come from? A man bought my paintings, she whispered, still overwhelmed. He gave me this. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, hope flickered in them. They wasted no time. Within the hour, they were at the hospital, speaking to doctors, making plans for treatment. Aisha sat beside her mother, holding her hand, knowing that things were finally going to be okay. But just when she thought the story had ended, the shocking twist happened. The next day, as she sat in the waiting room, she overheard two nurses talking excitedly. "Did you hear?" one of them said. "A famous billionaire was spotted in the city yesterday." Aisha's ears perked up. "Yes," the other nurse replied. "Apparently, he likes to walk around unnoticed, helping people in secret. No cameras, no publicity, just pure kindness." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? She reached into her pocket, pulling out the painting she had been too nervous to sell the day before. It was the same one the man had admired before handing her the envelope. Her heart pounded as she flipped it over. There, on the back, was a signature, a name. Aisha's eyes widened. It was him, the billionaire, the man who had given her the money. Her hands trembled as she realized the truth. The person who had saved her mother's life was one of the most powerful men in the world. And yet, he had asked for nothing in return. No recognition, no fame, just kindness. Tears streamed down her face as she held the painting close. Sometimes, the biggest miracles happen when you least expect them. And sometimes, the world's greatest heroes do not wear capes. They simply stop and help. The city moved like a restless ocean, waves of people flowing through the streets, each caught in their own currents of life. No one had time to stop. No one had time to notice. And in the middle of it all, a little girl stood alone. Aisha, just 8 years old, clutched a stack of paintings in her tiny hands. Her eyes darted across the crowd, searching for anyone, who would stop and buy her work. She had spent hours standing in the same spot, her legs aching, her stomach empty, but she could not go home. She could not leave until she had sold enough, because her mother's life depended on it. The doctors had told them the truth. Her mother needed expensive medicine, treatment that they simply could not afford. But Aisha was not willing to accept that. She had talent, she had hope, and she had paint. So, she painted. She poured her heart into each stroke, creating pieces full of color, beauty, and silent desperation. And now, all she needed was for someone to see them. But no one did. People walked past her without a second glance, lost in their own concerns. Some looked at her paintings briefly, their faces unreadable, before moving on. Others did not even notice her. She was invisible, her fingers clenched around the edges of her paintings, her vision blurring with unshed tears. Was this it? Was this all she could do? And then a shadow loomed over her. A man had stopped, tall, dressed in a simple but elegant suit. He studied her artwork with a quiet intensity. He did not speak right away. He did not glance at her with pity or indifference. He truly saw her. "These are yours." His voice was deep, steady. Aisha swallowed hard and nodded. Yes. The man picked up one of the paintings, turning it slowly in his hands. "They are incredible," he murmured. She had heard those words before, but words did not buy medicine. Compliments did not save lives. "They are for sale," she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. He did not hesitate. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a thick envelope and placed it gently in her hands. Aisha gasped as she felt the weight of it. It was too heavy, Too much. She peeked inside and her breath caught. The envelope was filled with money, more than she had ever seen in her entire life. Her hands trembled. "Sir, this is too much." The man smiled. It was not the smile of someone who pitied her. It was something else, something deeper. "No, it is just enough," he said. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of people. Aisha stood frozen, the envelope clutched to her chest, her heart racing. This was real. This was happening. She had enough to save her mother. She sprinted home, nearly tripping over her own feet as she burst through the door. "Mama," she cried, her voice shaking. "We can go to the hospital now." Her mother looked up from her worn-out blanket, her tired eyes filled with confusion. "Aisha, what are you talking about?" Aisha dropped the envelope onto the table, spilling some of the cash onto the surface. "A man bought my paintings," she gasped, still breathless. "He gave me this." Her mother's hands trembled as she picked up the money, her eyes filling with tears. Who was he?" Aisha shook her head. "I do not know." And that was the truth. She never got his name. She never got to thank him. But the next day, everything changed. As she sat beside her mother in the hospital, flipping through an old newspaper left in the waiting room, something caught her eye. A photograph. Her heart stopped. It was him, the same man who had bought her paintings, the same man who had given her more money than she could have ever imagined. She stared at the headline above the photo, her breath catching in her throat. "Mysterious billionaire philanthropist spotted in the city." Who is he? Aisha's fingers tightened around the paper. A billionaire? She scanned the article, her mind spinning. It spoke of a man known for his secret acts of kindness. He was famous, yet he avoided the spotlight. He had been seen traveling through cities, helping people in need, but he never revealed his name when he did. And yesterday he had chosen her. Tears welled up in her eyes. This was not just luck. This was something bigger. She looked up at her mother, who was now speaking to a doctor, hope shining in her tired eyes. Everything was going to be okay. Aisha exhaled shakily, her gaze drifting back to the newspaper. A heart-stopping revelation. She knew who he was now, and she would never forget him. Sometimes, the greatest miracles happen in the quietest moments. And sometimes, the people who change our lives forever are the ones who expect nothing in return. Aisha would never see him again, but she would remember him forever. The world moves fast, too fast. People rush through life, eyes glued to their screens, minds lost in their own concerns. In the chaos of the city streets, it is easy to miss the small things. And on this particular day, nearly everyone did, except for one man. Aisha, just 8 years old, stood alone on a busy sidewalk, clutching a bundle of paintings. Her tiny hands trembled, not from the cold, but from exhaustion and desperation. She had been standing in the same spot for hours, watching people walk past her as if she were invisible. She was not selling paintings for fun. She was selling them to save her mother's life. Her mother had been sick for months. The hospital visits drained what little money they had, and now the doctors had given them terrible news. Without urgent treatment, she would not make it. But Aisha was not ready to give up. With no one else to turn to, she did the only thing she could. She picked up her paintbrush, poured her emotions onto the canvas, and set out to sell her work. Yet, no one seemed to care. People glanced at her and walked away. Some admired her paintings, even smiled, but admiration did not pay for medicine. Compliments did not stop the clock from running out. Hope was slipping away. And then something unexpected happened. A man stopped. Tall, dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, he studied her paintings in silence. He did not glance at her with pity or indifference. He truly saw her. "These are yours?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Aisha nodded. "Yes, sir." The man picked up a painting and examined it closely. His expression was unreadable. "These are beautiful," he finally said. Aisha's throat tightened. "They are for sale." He nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. Without a word, he placed it in her hands. Aisha's breath hitched. The envelope was heavy. When she opened it, she nearly dropped it in shock. It was filled with money, more than she had ever seen, more than enough to pay for her mother's treatment. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Sir, this is too much." The man gave her a small smile. "No, it is just enough." Before she could say anything else, before she could even fully grasp what had just happened, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Aisha stood frozen, her heart pounding. This was real. This was happening. She spun around, trying to catch another glimpse of the man, but he was gone. People had been walking past her all day, barely noticing her struggle. But someone had, and that someone had just changed everything. Her hands trembled as she clutched the envelope to her chest. This was enough. This was what she had been praying for. She ran home as fast as she could, nearly stumbling on the pavement in her rush to reach her mother. When she burst through the door, her mother looked up in confusion. "Aisha, what is wrong?" Aisha dropped the envelope onto the table, gasping for breath. "We can go to the hospital now." Her mother's eyes widened as she opened the envelope, her hands shaking as she pulled out the thick stack of cash. "Aisha, where did this come from?" "A man," Aisha whispered. "He bought my paintings." Her mother's lips parted, but no words came out. The next few hours were a blur. Doctors, nurses, hospital corridors. And then hope. The treatment her mother so desperately needed was finally within reach. But what Aisha did not know was that someone had been watching. Someone had captured everything. Unbeknownst to her, a bystander had been filming when the mysterious man stopped to buy her paintings. The moment he placed the envelope in her hands, the look on her face when she realized what was inside. The video was uploaded to social media that very night, and it exploded. Within hours, the footage had spread like wildfire. Millions of people watched as an innocent little girl's world changed in an instant. They saw the kindness of a stranger. They saw raw emotion, tears, gasps, shock, gratitude. But the biggest shock came the next morning, when the world found out who the man was. Aisha had not recognized him at first, but someone online did. He was not just any man. He was a billionaire, a powerful, influential figure known for his secrecy. And yet, there he was, in the middle of a busy street, helping a little girl in need, without cameras, without publicity, without expecting anything in return. Aisha's story was now everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Journalists wanted to know more. The world wanted to know more. But the billionaire? He had already disappeared, just as quietly as he had arrived. Aisha held her mother's hand as they watched the video on a borrowed phone. Her mother wiped away tears, unable to find the right words. Aisha did not need them. She looked down at the one painting she had been too nervous to sell that day, the one she had kept for herself. The man had admired it before handing her the envelope. On a sudden impulse, she flipped it over, and there, in the corner of the canvas, was something she had not noticed before. A signature, her breath caught in her throat, a name, and in that moment, she understood everything. Some acts of kindness are caught on camera. Others remain a secret forever, but all of them have the power to change lives. Aisha would never forget the man who had saved her mother. And now, neither would the world. The city never stopped moving. Cars honked, footsteps echoed, and conversations blurred into a distant hum. Among the endless motion, one small figure stood still. Aisha, just 8 years old, held a stack of paintings close to her chest. She had been standing in the same spot for hours, trying to sell her artwork. She was not doing it for fun. She was not doing it for fame. She was doing it to save her mother's life. The hospital bills were piling up. The doctors had warned her that time was running out. And yet, as the world rushed by, no one seemed to care. People glanced at her. Some admired her paintings. But admiration did not pay for medicine. Tears burned in her eyes. Maybe this had been a foolish idea. Maybe no one would ever stop. And then, something changed. A shadow fell over her. A man had stopped, tall, well-dressed, and carrying an air of quiet confidence. He picked up one of her paintings. His fingers traced the strokes, as if he could feel the emotion within them. "These are yours?" he asked. Aisha nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The man studied her face. Then, without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This should be enough," he said, placing it in her hands. She nearly dropped it. It was heavy, too heavy. When she opened it, her breath hitched. Stacks of cash. More money than she had ever seen. More than enough for the treatment her mother needed. Tears streamed down her face. "Sir, this is too much." The man smiled, but there was something deep behind his eyes. Something she could not quite understand. "No," he said. "It is exactly what you need." And just like that, he turned and walked away. Aisha tried to call out, tried to ask his name, but he disappeared into the sea of people. She clutched the envelope to her chest, her heart racing. This was real. This was happening. She sprinted home, barely able to breathe as she burst through the door. "Mama, we can go to the hospital now." Her mother, frail and exhausted, sat up in shock. "Aisha, what are you talking about?" Aisha emptied the envelope onto the table. The sight of the money left her mother speechless. Tears streamed down her face. Where did you get this?" "A man bought my paintings," Aisha whispered. "He gave me this." Her mother's hands trembled as she touched the cash, disbelief in her eyes. "Who was he?" Aisha shook her head. "I do not know." That night, she barely slept. She kept replaying the moment in her head, trying to understand why a stranger had been so kind. But the next morning, she got her answer. The world woke up to a viral video. Someone had been filming when the man bought her paintings. The footage showed Aisha's shocked expression, the way she clutched the envelope, the way she cried. Millions of people watched. Millions of people shared. And then the truth came out. The man in the video, he was not just any man. He was one of the richest, most influential people in the world. A billionaire who was known for avoiding the public eye. The comments exploded. People could not believe what they were seeing. The kindness, the generosity, the life-changing moment that no one saw coming. And yet, the man himself, he remained silent. No interviews, no statements, no attempts to take credit. He had done it for one reason only, because he could, because kindness does not need an audience. Aisha sat with her mother, watching the news, her heart pounding. She had never expected her story to be seen by millions. She had never expected her paintings to change everything. But here she was, and the world would never forget what had happened.